All right.
I may regret saying this, but I do have a license of my own that I could host if it absolutely went sideways. So.
Okay, everybody, welcome to our meeting. It is July 13th. We're going to be talking about transportation and land use today. If you could please mute yourselves while the presenters are on so we don't get any outside noise, I'd appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. All right, can everyone see that? Cool. All right. So again, we are the Climate Change Comprehensive Plan Amendment Committee, long name. Come on, bud. All right. So some housekeeping, please keep your cameras on since this is being recorded and it's going to be up on our website for the public to view later. Could I have someone volunteer as a note taker for this session? I really appreciate everyone that stepped up in the last couple sessions.
I'll volunteer. Can I get some slides afterwards too?
Yeah, of course.
Right.
Thank you, Georgina.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right. And then if you haven't sent me your two goals and policies related to buildings and energy, I'd really appreciate those ASAP. And then if you have any kind of leftover homework from our other sessions, I'd appreciate that at some time as well. So to recap, we talked about buildings and energy in our last session with Kathleen Petrie and Beth Dolio. We learned buildings are the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, kind of within the scope of greenhouse gas sources. Many appliances are fueled by fossil fuels like natural gas, and building code can make headway in reducing fossil fuel dependence. The city can support progressive infrastructure like heat pumps, weatherization, and electric vehicle charging, so these things don't have to be retrofitted down the line. I appreciate everyone that sent me goals and policies from our last session. They were really great. So just to recap, I know I've probably harped on this so many times, but we're learning about topics related to climate change. We're moving towards drafting a comprehensive plan amendment. I'm talking to council at the end of this month about next steps about what they want to do. So I'll have a little bit of an update soon on how we proceed there. And then, we'll have to take it through the legislative process. So we're here July 13th. Our next session, which is kind of our last educational session, will be around state approaches, waste, and a little bit on community development. And then the day after, I'm going to be talking to council about how they want to take this forward. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce one of our two speakers. We have Tim Trahimovic from FutureWise. We also have Leah Missick from Climate Solutions. We're going to start with Tim. He's going to talk about climate change and land use. So Tim, I can either let you share your screen or you can tell me how to click through on this presentation. What would you prefer?
I can go either way. Since you're sharing already, why don't you go ahead and share?
Great. All right, Tim, take it away.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for inviting me to speak here today. Very much appreciate it. FutureWise, there we go. I guess I should learn to talk a little better. FutureWise is a statewide nonprofit. We work throughout Washington state to make cities and towns great places to live and to protect farms, forests, and shorelines for this and future generations. One of the things we do is do research and advocacy, including the kind of speeches I'm going to make here today. And hopefully I will be answering your question. May I have the second slide, please? There are, I hope, three main takeaways from my presentation today. The first is that the greenhouse inventories that the State Department of Ecology are doing that try to quantify all of the greenhouse emissions in Washington state show that we've been making progress, but it's been uneven. We actually reached our 2020 target earlier, but now the most recent information we have shows that we're above that. And we're also not on a path to achieve the required greenhouse reduction requirements that are in state law. They're in RCW 70A45020. And I'll show you a graph about that in a minute. The good news is we can achieve these requirements. Peer-reviewed studies have shown that we can get there. That's really good news. And that's good news because the adverse impacts of global warming are happening now. They're going to get worse, and we need to start addressing them. May I have the next slide, please? Global warming has and is going to continue to harm Washington, including Gig Harbor. The average global temperatures have increased about 1 degree centigrade, or excuse me, not centigrade. That's the old term for it, Celsius, there we go, which is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And on a global average is actually quite bad. According to the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, by mid-century, if greenhouse gas emissions continue on their current pathway, the average year in Washington will be warmer than the hottest year of the 20th century. Warming, sea level rise, and ocean acidification are expected to stress Washington's coastal communities and fisheries. That includes Gig Harbor, the oysters and the other sea creatures that live in your community are currently stressed, and they're going to become more stressed. The next slide, please. Our built environment, the transportation systems, our water systems, our wastewater and energy systems will face increased climate-related hazards. Storms are going to be more intense. You may have noticed that just in your own life. I know that the storms I'm experiencing seem more intense than I remember. We're going to get more sea level rise. We already had sea level rise in the last century, but we're going to see more of it. And it's happening faster than many people thought it would. Coastal wastewater and stormwater collection systems are going to experience problems with saltwater intrusion, with corrosion, with flooding and inundation. It's going to increase the maintenance cost of those systems. Natural hazards such as flooding, landslides, and bluff erosion are going to increase. So that's pretty bad. And some of that is unfortunately already baked in. But as I said, the good news is we can fix it. Next slide, please. First of all, as I said, we've had some good news on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. On the left side of the screen, you can see a solid green area. That's the emissions that have been tracked by the Department of Ecology in its greenhouse gas emissions inventories that try to capture all of the emissions in the state. You can see that we peaked in 2000, we went down, and we've been bouncing around since then. So that's good. We're making some progress. The bad news is if you look on the right-hand side of the screen in the red there, you can see that we've got a lot of more emission reductions to do. And notice we've got to get to 95% below our 1990 emissions, what is effectively net zero. And as you can see from the graph, there's a lot that needs to be done. But as I said, we can get there. Next slide, please. And just to remind you, here is a breakout based on the 2017 inventory that Ecology did that was prepared by the Seattle Times. And you can see the various sectors. Residential, commercial, and industrial is the second largest sector. That's a land use sector, and it's increasing. It went from 18.6 million metric tons to 3.1 million metric tons, excuse me, in 2017. Transportation, which you're also going to hear about, is increasing as well. So while some things are getting better, our electrical system, for example, has actually reduced its greenhouse gas emissions. Other sectors are increasing. Next slide, please. But as I said, we can get there. A study was published in 2020 in the PNS, which is a public scientific peer-reviewed scientific journal. That study concluded that if the electrical grid is decarbonized, that is, we get rid of all the carbon energy on the electrical grid, then the residential housing sector can meet the 28% emission reduction target for 2025 under the Paris Agreement. So we can get there. All we have to do is take the carbon out of the electrical system. And Washington State is making significant progress on that front. So that's good news. However, grid decarbonization will be insufficient to meet the 80% emissions reduction target for 2050 due to a growing housing stock and continued use of fossil fuels, natural gas, propane, and fuel oil in homes. Meeting this target will also require deep energy retrofits and transitioning to distributed low carbon energy sources such as rooftop solar, as well as reducing per capita floor space and zoning denser settlement patterns. But if we do that, we can get there. Next slide, please. So as you can see, if we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, land use is an important piece of that. That study showed we have to do a better job of land use to reduce that greenhouse gas emissions. So what can Gig Harbor do? What can you do in your comprehensive plan? Well, the first thing you could do, and it's a very important thing, is to plan for and implement Vision 2050. I understand that you've heard from the Puget Sound Regional Council, so you probably know about Vision 2050. It's our region's comprehensive land use plan. And it has built within it emission reductions. And there are, of course, a couple of important parts built into Vision 2050. First is accommodate the city's growth targets. Both your housing and population targets are important to meet, so that's good. The second step is do not expand urban growth areas. Vision 2050 doesn't envision significant expansions of urban growth areas. And urban growth area expansions are difficult to reduce. In fact, they increase emissions through land clearing, through damage to wetlands, through increased transportation from low density development. So do not expand your urban growth areas. And then take other actions too. Vision 2050 talks about addressing displacement, talks about other common sense steps that all of our communities in Central Puget Sound, in King County, in Piers County, in Snohomish County, and in Kitsap County can do to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if we all work together to implement Vision 2050, we're going to get a long way there. But there's other things we're going to need to do. We're going to need to build a mix of small apartment buildings and modestly sized single-family homes at 8 or 9 housing units per acre. That study that I talked about before, that's the target densities that they concluded will help us meet those Paris targets, and our state targets are related to the Paris targets. We also need to provide for transit-oriented development downtown, near frequently served transit stops and at activity centers. And when I say mixed, or when I say transit-oriented development, I'm talking about mixed use and multifamily dwellings. I'm talking about them at densities that are affordable to all economic segments. Those densities vary with where you are in the Puget Sound region. In some areas like Seattle, which is a high cost area, they're very high, but particularly at the lower income levels. But in other areas, they're not so high. But we're probably talking about 20 to 30 to 40 to 60 units per acre. And in some parts of Seattle, we're talking about 100 units per acre to be affordable. Next slide, please. And there's more as well. You can incorporate policies to plant trees and street medians, and I know that Gig Harbor has some of these already, in between sidewalks and streets. And those trees are important because they absorb carbon, but they also make it much more pleasant to walk and bike and do things like that that have less carbon impact. You can also develop and adopt an urban forestry plan if you've not already done so. You can include complementary land uses not already present in your zoning districts, such as supermarkets, parks, and schools, and neighborhoods, and residential uses in business districts. And by building those kinds of uses close in, you can really save a significant amount of energy. A study was done last year that said in suburban areas, one of the big barriers to people telecommuting is that they have to drive their children a long ways for childcare. If you've got childcare in the neighborhood, you can work from home and you don't have to just drive into the office because that's where the child care center is. Also review and update heat response plans based on climate heat event, that is heat event projections. That's a significant impact of global warming. That's also one of our most hazardous natural hazards. The next slide, please. Okay, so that's the mitigation side. That's reducing the greenhouse gas emissions so that the worst effects of climate change don't happen. But we've already got some effects already built in. For the Gig Harbor area, a series of projections were done for Washington State in 2018, and they project from 2 to 5 feet of sea level rise in Gig Harbor by 2100. This is a clip off of the NOAA sea level rise viewer that shows what that looks like in Gig Harbor. The dark color, of course, is the deeper water. That's really mostly the harbor that is Gig Harbor now, and of course Puget Sound. And then the lighter blue areas are areas that would be inundated by 5 feet of sea level rise. The good news is for Gig Harbor, that's not a large area. The bad news is unfortunately parts of Gig Harbor will be inundated by sea level rise if nothing is done. And we can't stop that. That's built into the climate system right now. So we've got to figure out a way of dealing with it. Next slide, please. One of the significant adverse effects of sea level rise is it has the potential to drown marine wetlands and marshes. On the top there of the screen, you can see the diagram showing you the current sea level, future sea level, and a sort of theorized, idealized salt marsh. And if you build a seawall there, you're going to block the movement of that salt marsh as sea level rises. But if you have a resilient habitat types on the diagram below, you can see that the marsh can migrate as sea levels rise. And if we don't provide for the migration of marshes and wetlands, we're going to lose those important ecological functions, and it's going to damage our fish and wildlife habitats. And we're also going to lose the vegetation that minimizes the damage from storms on uplands. Next slide, please. So what can we do about that? I'm a big fan of the process that the California Coastal Commission recommends, and they have a 6-step process. The first is determine the levels of sea level rise that are likely to happen in Gig Harbor. The California Coastal Commission says we should look out 75 to 100 years or longer because that's how long buildings built now are expected to last. Then the second step is you identify potential physical sea level rise impacts on the city's shorelines. Are they going to damage buildings? Is it going to damage parks? Is it going to cause erosion? Is it going to flood marshes and wetlands? The third step is to assess those risks, and especially the risk to development on shorelines subject to tidal influence. The fourth step is to identify adaptation strategies to minimize the risk. The Coastal Commission has several adaptation strategies that they recommend people consider. Some of them are fairly passive. If you've got a significant area of uplands between development, you can just allow the sea to rise onto that. Others are much more active, building seawalls or even managed retreat. So again, you look at your shorelines, you look at these different strategies and figure out which are most important. The fifth steps and are most likely to work in your community. The fifth step is to adopt policies and regulations that incorporate your selected adaptation strategies. And then 6, you implement them and monitor them as it happens. The Coastal Commission recommends those be updated every 5 to 10 years because the data that we're getting on sea level rise is increasing and becoming better over time. And we're just learning more, plus sea level is rising faster than was anticipated. So we've got to take that into account too. So that's a way that you can address sea level rise. And I think that's a really smart approach. I'd urge you to take it. Next slide, please. What else can you do? You can plan for increasing stormwater runoff and flooding. And you can do this by replacing culverts and things like that. You can use green infrastructure and low impact techniques to address flooding and stormwater. Conduct an an assessment to identify stormwater outfalls that are most likely to be flooded. As sea level rises and your outfalls get flooded, your water can't get into Gig Harbor, can't get into Puget Sound. And so then you get flooding upland as well. That's happening in Olympia. It's happening a lot in Florida, and we're going to see more of it here in Washington, unfortunately. You can discourage or prohibit development in natural hazards, such as floodplains and landslide hazards. One of the impacts of global warming is that because the atmosphere is warmer, it holds more water, and we get these more intense storms, which then make it more likely we're going to get landslides. There are other impacts on landslides as well, such as freezing and thawing throughout more of the year, which can also dislodge them and things like that. And so it makes sense for us to reconsider whether we want to build in these areas. Next slide, please. We can also review construction standards for docks, piers, and wharves to make sure they're going to be strong enough for the increased storms and increased tides that we're going to get because of sea level rise. And so that's an important step as well. We can increase the use of sponge parks to increase recreation space while mitigating increased flood risk. Or you can do what Tacoma did. They've rebuilt one of their parks on Puget Sound so that the facilities that will be damaged by sea level rise were moved out of the way, and the parts of the park that aren't going to be damaged, such as the beach, is wider and allows the water to come in as it's rising and as tides happen, because sea level rise just isn't going to mean that all of a sudden Puget Sound is higher. What it means that it does mean that Puget Sound will get higher over time, but it also means that storms are going to be higher because the base water level is higher. And so there are a lot of different impacts on that. And
Tim,
having parks,
sorry, could you define sponge parks for the group? I'm not sure that that's a common term.
It's probably not, and I should have defined it. I apologize. It's a park that's designed to either accommodate or absorb or store water. Some of them in upland areas, for example, will have depressions where water can store, and then it'll either evaporate or sink into the ground or both, and you can use it as a play area. Or if it's on Puget Sound, you design it so that it can be inundated by water periodically and still function as a park. And there's a bunch of different designs for it depending on where you are and what you're trying to accommodate. And I think we've got someone raised their hand. I don't know if we want to answer that question now or if we want to wait.
I was just going to mention that that's kind of, we're trying to do more of that, because a lot of times the spaces where we need to store floodwater, in the summer, they're great recreational spaces, or can be. So it's multi-use of those kinds of spaces. So they're designed not just for recreational use or not just for flood storage, but to accommodate the different needs that you have at different times of the year. So sorry, I'm with Pierce County's surface water management.
That's great. And one of the great things about that is you've got less flooding, but the taxpayers and ratepayers save money too, right? Because they're sharing a space. So it's cost effective and it's good. So yeah, that's great that you're doing that. We can also incorporate climate change into critical area regulations. For example, because of these more intense storms, some wetlands are going to get bigger over time because they're going to have more water and they're going to fill. And so we should, oops. All right. That was my 20-minute timer. And I almost made it. So anyway, they're going to get bigger. It always shocks me when my timer goes off. I don't know why it should, because I said it right, but nevertheless, it shocks me. But anyway, these wetlands are getting bigger, and so we should accommodate that in our critical areas regulations and have wider buffers around them. And there's other impacts too, the increased flooding and things like that. So we need to update our critical area regulations to incorporate these standards. And I think that's the last of my content slides, right? Yep. I put some links there in case you're interested in checking out some of the reports and studies that I've talked about today. So again, thank you a lot for inviting me here today. I'm going to be here till 4, and I look forward to answering your questions or hearing your opinions.
All right. Thank you so much, Tim. Does anyone have any questions for Tim before we take our break? Go for it, Carl.
Yeah, Tim, just really quick, could you please go over, if you know, and maybe you don't, but a couple of the other actions that you noted that are found in Vision 2050? You know, while I have read Vision 2050, I'm fairly familiar with it. I don't know it to a T, but I'd just be interested to hear what other actions you think might be in there that would be useful to us.
And this kind of intrudes on Leah's presentation, but there's a number of policies and actions related to multimodal transportation. There's a call for addressing economic displacement, both of businesses and residences. There are requirements for protecting farmland, for protecting forests, for protecting critical areas. So there's quite a lot of it. It's a comprehensive plan for the region. And so there's a lot of content in it, but I think those are some of the important topics.
Thanks so much, Tim. And I appreciated you relating it to Vision 2050, because I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think that if we could follow that plan to a T, it has the model built into it for us. You know, it's up to us to implement it at this point.
Yeah, and they've modeled the impacts of Vision 2050 on greenhouse gas production. So they've already done some of that work for you.
Good question, Carl. No other questions for Tim? Maybe we're all still a little burned out from July 4th and the hot
Roxanne,
weather.
Can I get one quick one in, Roxanne?
Of course.
Hey, Tim, talking about greenhouse gases and the state study of it, I struggle with the fact that the state study it at pretty high levels and we are a small little city. How do we extrapolate our numbers from all the big studies that have been done out there, or do we even bother and just say transportation and buildings are what we're going to hit and just leave it at that?
Well, you know, I think there are different ways that you can do that. And, you know, I think several different answers are valid. You can do your own projections. There are online tools that you can use for that purposes, some of which come pre-populated with various kinds of emission levels, and you tell it, you know, different kinds of housing that you have and different kinds of businesses, and it can come up with some estimates, and they've calibrated them, so they can be fairly good. Another way of doing it is you could either individually or as a region put together a model. I don't know that would be, I don't know if I were Gig Harbor, I would invest a lot of money in a model. You know, that can be fairly expensive. But Thurston Regional did a model for the Thurston region and then modeled what are going to be the greenhouse gas effects of the various policies that they proposed. And they concluded that the policy package they proposed would reach the state's old target, not the new target, but the old target, because their model was done before the new target was adopted. So you could do that. Again, I don't know if that's the best investment. The State Department of Commerce is putting together guidance on planning for greenhouse gas emission reductions. And they're going to probably, they haven't done it yet, but they're probably going to put together a menu of actions that you can take and indicate in some way what are going to be the greenhouse gas emission reductions by those various actions. And so just by picking enough actions off the menu, you can also get an estimate of what the reduction are going to be. So there's different ways you can do it. And you'll have to decide what fits your budget and your time frame. The idea of getting, doing something now and then getting Commerce's guidance in a year or two, and then seeing how well that's doing. To me as a planner, and I'm both a planner and an attorney, it's kind of an attractive approach because I think it's going to be cost effective and will help you get where you need to go, particularly if you're also following Vision 2050, which again had that regional modeling done about greenhouse gas emissions.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm glad that you brought up the effects of seawalls on the shoreline and how they can actually degrade it over time. I used to work for Kitsap County, and there were some instances on the shorelines there where people were armoring the shorelines by chaining logs up, and it was actually creating wave refractions that were creating like really dangerous shoreline degradation. And we all went out there and we're like, you gotta take these out. And it's not always like it's not super intuitive, but yeah, soft shorelines are really, really helpful, I think.
And Kitsap County has done some great work on soft shorelines. They have incentives to encourage people to put in soft shorelines. I think it's great. Dr. Dittweiler and others up in the Friday Harbor Laboratory at the University of Washington did a study about 5 years ago, and they documented that the impacts of bulkheads were significantly worse than we thought they were. We always thought they were bad. There have been studies that showed they were bad, but they showed that they not only impact the specific beach on which the bulkhead is built, but they also have a sound-wide impact.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just that particular beach that gets scoured out, but there are impacts all over the sound that are happening because of bulkheading. So yeah, that's a serious problem. We are going to see situations where because of sea level rise, people are going to need to do something to protect some fairly significant incentives, or not incentives, but facilities and buildings. And hopefully we're going to be able to do that in a way that's not going to continue to destroy Puget Sound.
Yeah, it was wild there on Apple Tree Point. It was like people had chained up logs, and then like 500 feet down the beach is where it was being scoured away, and like the foundation of a house was being compromised. Carl, you had a question.
Hey, Tim, you mentioned that we need to get to 8 or 9 units per acre. Where did you cite that from? Where is that coming from again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's the study that was done by, where is it here? Gotta get the right slide here. Yeah, that's the Goldstein study, the carbon footprint of household energy use in the United States. And I have a link to that on my 7th slide. So you can go to it. It's in a public domain peer-reviewed journal. And so you can see the whole study there. They've also got appendices, that give way more detail on that. But they found in their analysis and their modeling that when you get to that level, which they expressed as 5,000 people per square kilometer, that there's a significant savings in energy and a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions.
Oh, great. Thank you for that, Tim. I appreciate that. I'll take a look at that study. It's interesting.
Okay, we'll maybe do one more question before we go to break. Anybody have anything? Okay, if nobody has any burning questions, Tim will also be here through the end of the session, so we can, we're lucky we can have him on to answer questions at the end. But with that, let's take a 5-minute bio break, come back at 2:52. Thanks. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Tim, Robert, glad you got to connect over the break. Robert is definitely one of our very diligent participants. I'm glad you're here, Robert.
Thank you.
Okay. Almost got everybody back. Leah, do you have a preference for me moving through the slides, or do you want to control your own screen?
If you already have them pulled up on your computer, go ahead and
Okay.
you can share them as well. Thank you.
Great. Okay, we got most people. All right, everyone can see that? Okay, so next we'll be hearing from Leah Missick of Climate Solutions, talking about transportation policy across a number of scales. So Leah, I will hand it off to you.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. And again, I'm our transportation policy person for Washington at Climate Solutions. For those who don't know, Climate Solutions is a regional nonprofit. We operate in both Washington and Oregon, and we're pushing to accelerate clean energy solutions to the climate crisis. So I personally do quite a lot of work across different levels in Washington with research, policy development and design, and advocacy to try to clean up our transportation system. And really glad that you all are here to listen today. And I'll similarly to Tim sort of give a high level overview of what I'm talking about and sort of a high level understanding of why I'm advocating for certain actions, and then zoom down into the Gig Harbor level as to what are different possibilities that you all could include in your comprehensive plan, or frankly in other city policies. So let's go. Next slide, please. All right, so this is very similar to what Tim showed you, just from a slightly different source. So in Washington, we have a state energy strategy, which is actually a really good use of a really good source of information as to where we have been historically and where we need to go in terms of emissions. And as Tim showed earlier, we need to basically hit net zero emissions by 2050. And what the state energy strategy did was it actually modeled what a business as usual case would look like in scenario, what our emissions would look like. And as you can see, that top dotted line there is the reference scenario. That's what that is. And you can see emissions kind of stay, fluctuate, stay steady more or less. Not what we need to do by any means. And then the state energy strategy actually modeled different pathways and different sort of levels of clean energy adoption for different sectors that would get us to where we need to go, and also evaluated the costs of those different strategies. And you can see under the electrification scenario that they modeled, which was the most cost effective, it relies really heavily on electrifying our transportation system as well as our buildings and using cleaner fuels for industry. We can get us there, but it's going to take electrification. Next slide, please. So we know where we need to go in terms of what the state energy strategy says. There's also a body of research. Climate Solutions actually did research on what it would take to electrify our transportation system in both Washington and Oregon. So we actually partnered with the researchers at the state energy strategy and tried to make sure our numbers are aligned so we could have some sort of common ground to evaluate our research under. And we found that we could meet our climate goals if we basically electrified all the vehicles on the road, or most of the vehicles on the road, which isn't a huge surprise. Part of the reason why electrification is so critical here in Washington state is that we actually are moving our way to a 100% clean grid. It is state law that our electricity grid has to be fossil free by 2045. So that's a key point. It's already quite clean. It's going to be fossil free in 2045. So if we electrify everything on a rapidly cleaning grid, we're going to get to our goals that we need to hit. Again, that is going to take massive vehicle electrification, though, and we're going to have to work on that. And we would not only reach our climate goals, but our health would benefit massively. And again, I'm more than happy to share the link to this research if folks want to dig in, because the research modeled specifically, like what are the specific health impacts, for example, for different parts of the state. It's really interesting, and for different demographics. But we also did find that if we modeled the scenario where we not only electrified, but we paired that with reducing how many miles we drive, that's actually an even better option. So this table below shows a snippet of the research, but basically that combined scenario where we reduce our driving and then electrify what remains on the road, that actually helps us save money. We spend less on road costs. We do spend more on transit costs, but the incremental electricity costs are less, and we end up saving money overall. And also individuals would save money because it costs quite a lot to own and maintain a car, as it turns out. So again, what we are advocating for as climate solutions, based on the research, is that it is important to go through this mixed approach of reduce vehicle miles traveled and electrify all vehicles on the road. Next slide, please. So again, this is something that we can and we should do. It is going to take effort, right? Because we do need to improve access to getting around without a vehicle through some of the land use stuff that Tim talked about, also through improving transit and making it safer to walk and bike. And we also need to support vehicle electrification. But where we get with this is not only do we hit our climate goals, but we see fewer crash deaths, for example, more people using active transportation. So again, this is a scenario that we can reach, and we really need to work to advocate for it. Next slide, please. So what would actually get us there in terms of the hard numbers? The state energy strategy, as I said, modeled what this would look like. If we reduce our vehicle miles traveled between 15 and 29%, depending on the vehicle type, 29% for light duty vehicles, which are like our cars that people drive like I drive, or 15% for our bigger vehicles like medium and heavy duty freight vehicles. Plus, if we combine that with 100% electric light duty sales in 2035 and 70 to 100% depending on vehicle class for larger vehicles by 2045. Now, I know those two numbers sound really big. I'm going to come back to them. Next slide, please. So it's also important when you're sort of figuring out what does Gig Harbor want to do. It's good to look at what policies already exist at the state level and how that could help Gig Harbor, and also where are opportunities and gaps in terms of policy where it's really important for local governments to step in and fill any gaps, or they're more in tune with the community and can provide their own sort of specific context to different policies. So we actually have a pretty good policy regime that is about to kick in Washington State that does a lot. It's not 100% of what we need, but it fills some important gaps. So on January 1st of 2023, the Climate Commitment Act is going to be implemented in Washington State. This is a statewide cap on emissions from the largest polluter. So it covers about 75% of greenhouse gas emissions in the state right now. It's a declining cap that is supposed to track with our greenhouse gas emissions goals that Tim talked about that are in law. In addition, this is going to raise a lot of money for the state that has to be then spent again on clean, climate-friendly options in transportation, in buildings, and more. Also on January 1st, we have a clean fuel standard kicking in that requires cleaner transportation fuels over time. This is also going to provide some revenue for electric utilities that provide clean fuels, and those utilities then have to spend that money to assist in transportation electrification. We have quite a lot of investment dollars that are going to be coming down the pipe from federal and state governments for electric vehicles and EV chargers, which is great. Washington has, we're right now in the process of rulemaking. It's state law that we have to complete it. We're about to adopt the zero emission vehicle program. This will require an increasing percentage of passenger vehicles to be sold that are ZEV, so zero emission vehicles. That could be mostly electric vehicles, could be fuel cell vehicles. And it's going to require 100% new vehicles sold in Washington State starting in model year 2035 are electric. That is a state law that we are following this pathway. And so as I pointed out, that number sounds really big, but we're actually on a trajectory there. We have a similar program called the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, which applies to medium and heavy duty vehicles. It's a bit slower of a trajectory, a little bit harder of a sector right now. We also have EV rebates, state and federal tax waivers or rebates that depend on the vehicle, how much they are. At our state code, we require that new commercial buildings accommodate for EV charging. That's likely to expand for residential. Last session, the Washington State Legislature passed Move Ahead Washington, which is a big transportation investment package with significant funding coming from the Climate Commitment Act that will go to transit, bike and pedestrian infrastructure, and more. And then finally, utilities are able to provide incentives to increase transportation electrification. So we have a lot of good stuff already going on in Washington. And this is great. I also do want to point out that in that studies show that once a technology hits about 5% adoption for new sales, that's actually a really quick tipping point. And that has been the case. We have hit the 5% in the US, and based on other countries that have seen rapidly accelerating electric vehicle adoption, 5% was their threshold. In Washington, we're at 10%. So it doesn't sound like much, but if you think back to, for example, when folks started getting iPhones and everybody's like, ooh, I know a couple people with iPhones. What's that? A few years later, everybody had an iPhone. So we're really on the cusp of something here in Washington, which is great. But that also means that A, we need to be ready, and B, we need to still fill those gaps, because, you know, as great as our policy regime, as much as it has improved, we still have quite a ways to go to meet our climate goals. So next slide, please. So what gaps can local government fill? There's quite a lot. These are some things that I have come up with and that I've seen local governments work effectively on. So just wanted to throw out some examples to give you all food for thought, because frankly, I'm sure you could think of a lot more stuff. And I'll go through each one of these, but quickly, safe ways to get around without a car, making sure that EV charging is adequate and that it is convenient, making sure that local governments and utilities provide support for transportation electrification. It's great for cities to lead the way with their own fleets, for example, their own buildings. Pilot projects and demonstrations are a great way to sort of test new things, get folks excited, and then also through legislative advocacy, which is not necessarily a comp plan thing, but also really important. Next slide. So on the safe ways to get around without a car, I do want to note this does somewhat tie in with the land use stuff that Tim talked about. Of course, if you only have to make a trip that is 5 miles as opposed to 20 miles, it's much easier to do that, you know, through transit or through a bike or something like that. But you know, it's really important to make sure that you know, your surroundings feel safe, that you're willing to walk or ride a bike, for example. If you live near to different services, it doesn't feel great if you say, well, you know, it's only a 10-minute walk away, but I feel like I have to drive because there's not a good sidewalk, like it's not safe for me, right? So making sure that there's adequate accessible sidewalks, that there are bike paths, especially protected ones, because paint, unfortunately, doesn't mean that a car can't hit you. Allow for adequate housing near services, no forced sprawl. That gets to what Tim was talking about. Stuff like bus priority lanes and lights, safe and comfortable bus stops where people feel okay about waiting for the bus. Lower speed limits to make sure that folks, again, feel safer. It feels much better to have a car go by you at 25 miles per hour than it does at 45 miles per hour. And just overall safe street design. And these are all things that can be incorporated to hyperlocal activities and city activities. Next slide. And then, of course, that's sort of on the VMT reduction side. And we do need to make sure that for those folks who are driving, that we have adequate and convenient EV charging. And this isn't just for individuals like ourselves, it also is for companies that have fleets, right? And so, first of all, not everybody can necessarily charge at home. Not everybody has their own parking spot. Not everybody has a garage. And so making sure that there's public charging that is accessible for folks who maybe park on the street. There's really cool programs where you can actually install EV chargers on light posts. And so it's not in the way, it's not blocking the sidewalk, but it's really easy to park by that and then charge up. And we need to plan for charging infrastructure specifically that meets the needs of different groups, like apartment dwellers or others who don't have their own parking spot, for folks who are traveling, for delivery workers, and so on and so forth. And there are state and federal funding that's coming down the pipeline, and there can be utility investments. So working with the electric utility, I think, is really important, because again, they're going to be getting clean fuels revenue potentially if they opt into the program. They should, because then they could invest in providing chargers around their territory, for example. So the city working with them on that and saying, hey, we want to make sure this happens, I think is really important. And also the city being ready to advocate for itself when it comes to PSRC or entities like that are sort of distributing the funding, to make sure that you have a plan and have talked to those folks and understand, like, hey, we need chargers here, here, and here. This will meet the needs of our community. Next slide, please. As I mentioned briefly earlier, local government and utility support for electrification is really important. So it's not just about where the chargers are, but that public utilities can invest in electrification. They have the ability under state law to spend a certain amount of dollars coming in to install chargers, or to help folks even install chargers in their homes, because that actually puts downward pressure on rates for everybody. It's a win-win actually for the utility and for all ratepayers, even if they don't have an electric vehicle. So local utility, local electricity utility is able to do this, and I think it's a great thing. They should do this. So again, they can install public chargers. They can provide rebates for home and work charging. they can actually assist nonprofits with EVs. So for example, there's a really great program I've heard of up in Bellingham where they have where they do low income home retrofits, home energy retrofits, and they have trucks that drive around and do the work, and they actually got electric vehicles to go around and do this work. So it's an extra win-win, right? And the utility, which is up there, Puget Sound Energy, helped them get those vehicles. And then also just providing education for folks on what different opportunities are out there, working with local auto dealers on, actually making sure they're doing a good job of providing info on EVs and letting folks know where chargers are. Because there's unfortunately also a gap of information. The EV industry is way ahead of where folks often imagine it to be in terms of how far cars can go, where chargers are, et cetera, et cetera. We also just want to make sure that processes make it simple to install infrastructure. We don't want there to be a lot of red tape and make it really difficult to get an EV charger, like a level 2 charger, a public charger for folks to use. And then good signage, which is also an education thing for folks to know that there are EV chargers around. I will say a new charger was actually installed where I live in South Seattle, not too far from me, but the signage is not great. So it's a fast charger. Folks could pull over and charge up really quickly there, but they need to know about it. So just bringing awareness to the fact that these things are out there is great. Next slide, please. Oh, I see a question. I can pause for questions if that works. So yeah.
Hey, yeah, I was just curious, the charger station that you just referenced in your neighborhood, is it a free one or do people have to pay?
You do have to pay typically for that kind of thing. I haven't personally used this one, so I can't say 100% for sure, but I'm almost positive you do pay. I will note that we have actually regulations in Washington that are coming down that sort of regulate public charging and make sure that one, they're not like charging an exploitative amount, right? So that's really important. So this would fall under that, also making sure that you can pay with credit card. You don't have to have a special fob, because up until recently, this has been more unregulated, and now we're starting to regulate that better in Washington. And right now, my understanding is that an e-gallon is about 95-ish or thereabout cents typically in Washington state, which is sort of a rough equivalent of, if you go to the pump now, it's, I don't even know what it is, 5 something a gallon, but if you're paying electricity, it would cost you about $1 to go the same distance. Yep. And one other question I see.
Yes, you talked about retrofitting in Bellingham, I think. Is that for chargers or what? And then about the trucks that were going around to neighborhoods and talking about that. What is that about?
Yeah, so actually, it's basically a program where it's a local nonprofit that serves the low income community, and basically the utility gave them electric vehicles for their service provision. So what this particular nonprofit does is it goes around to low income households and helps them with weatherizing their homes, so they spend less on their energy bills. But the contractors that are actually going to these homes from this nonprofit now have electric vehicles, so they can get around. There's also, options for, sort of food bank activities and stuff like that, where, there are different service providers that have to drive quite a lot to provide their services. And yeah, getting electric vehicles in their hands is great, right? Because it reduces pollution, and the service providers, which nonprofits often don't have a ton of money, have to pay all that much less for fuel.
Right. So so the retrofitting has to do with weatherization. Is that what that's about?
Yeah, it was just an example of the nonprofit sort of doing green work, but in a green way too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. All right, I don't see any questions, so I'll keep plugging on. So next slide, please. Thank you. One other thing that I think is really important is for local governments to sort of walk the talk, right? To tell other people to do something when a local government's not doing it themselves doesn't always sit well with folks. So one thing that local governments, I think, should do is install charging at public buildings where they have parking, making sure that folks are able, to access their public buildings, or even employees of different local governments of different cities are able to charge up when they're going to work, if they have to drive to work, for example. Government fleets should also transition to zero emission vehicles. There is actually an old state law that requires a clean fleet that has not been enforced. So technically, if feasible, all local governments should be running their fleets on either electricity or biofuels, but again, this has not been enforced. And I think it's something that is super critical for local governments to lead the way. Whenever local governments are working on purchasing a new vehicle, go with an electric vehicle. In most cases right now, it's possible. There are a few instances for like emergency vehicles and stuff where it might not quite fit, but for your average sedan, it doesn't make sense to buy a fossil fuel vehicle at this point, especially not if you're trying to walk the talk of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and meeting climate goals. And then also prioritize clean fleets for government contracts, right? I know a lot of times local governments work with different entities for service provisions. Folks who are going around and doing maintenance, garbage collection, whatever it may be. If possible, work with entities that do have clean fleets. I right now am on a big kick about electric garbage trucks. Just for folks to know, garbage trucks are lucky if they get 3 miles per gallon and they're burning diesel and they're going through neighborhoods. So they're basically causing a ton of pollution going back and forth in neighborhoods. Not the best. And there are electric garbage trucks out there. They exist. And this is an opportunity where you have a fixed route. You know where you're going. You're going to stay overnight to park and charge up. So it's a great application. We just got to get there. School buses are another one that I have been really pushing for. Electric school buses. Kids sitting inside diesel school buses are subject to really horrible pollution. And there have actually been studies about the impacts. So not great. We need to do better. So prioritizing clean fleets for different sort of public contracts is really important. Next slide, please. Pilot projects and demonstrations. What creative ideas do you all have, right? It could be these sort of public fleets things, or the public-private partnership when it comes to contracts, working together with a company to purchase a vehicle, to be the first garbage truck that's running on electric going around the town, or something like that, right? I'm sure there's a lot of different opportunities for stuff that the city could work on. So I think it'd be great for folks to sort of sit down and say like, hey, what is a really cool thing that we could do and set a really strong example of. I know King County actually just did a thing where they worked to purchase an electric semi truck from Kenworth Truck Manufacturing, which is actually based in Renton. So this truck was built in Renton. It's fully electric, and they purchased this truck to do refuse hauling to one of the big landfills. And so, that's the first one that has happened. And I think it would be really great to see other local governments basically say, hey, I'm going to be the first electric vehicle in this specific service or this specific sector. Next slide, please. And then, like I mentioned, this is not something that would necessarily be in comp plan or, a local ordinance or anything like that. But the state legislature does listen to local governments and local elected officials when it comes to different state policies. And I think it's really effective when local governments say, hey, if you pass this policy, it will really benefit our community, or it will open the door for our community to do X, Y, Z. So as I mentioned, for example, it was in 2019 that the state law passed that allows electric utilities to invest in transportation electrification infrastructure. Now, I know you all don't have like Seattle City Light or Tacoma Power. It's not directly affiliated with the city in that same way, but it was a really great thing for the state to pass that because then these local utilities and local governments were able to start taking action that they felt that they couldn't before. So, advocating to local government on those terms, from Climate Solutions perspective, one thing we're going to be advocating for to the legislature is to use some of the revenue coming in from the Climate Commitment Act to provide point of sale vouchers for medium and heavy duty vehicles that are electric. There is a cost delta between diesel vehicles and electric vehicles for these really big ones still. But if we need to see them on the road ASAP, we need to cover that cost gap. And so that's one thing that we're going to be advocating for. And I think local government saying, hey, we want to, work with contractors who are using electric vehicles. We want to have clean fleets running through our city, but we need help to get those dollars out there. I think it's so effective for local governments to put this on their legislative priorities. So I would just sort of put that out there, that governments talking to each other at different levels is also really cool. Next slide. And it's that. I am done. So happy to take any other questions that you have, or if you have any ideas about stuff. A lot of those ideas are pretd broad, but I think it'd be great for you all to brainstorm and come up with stuff that fits the local context. But yeah, I see a hand raised.
Hey, Leah, this is Kyla. And I just wanted to make a connection for everyone here about something we heard about the last meeting and thinking about working with contractors that have electric fleets. We talked about embodied carbon in buildings a little bit at the last meeting. So that's one of those things, and we're building a new structure, all of the equipment that's using fuel, burning fuel as their, like all the digging equipment and everything that's being used to build the building, that's all embodied carbon that, goes into the creation of that building. So I was also curious, Leah, if you've heard anything about, local construction, electric equipment, and if you have any advice there for like seeking contractors who are all electric or going electric or biofuel.
Yeah, that is a great question. That is awesome. I will say, unfortunately, on the construction side, there is a ways to go. I'm really eager that the Clean Fuel Standard is coming on board, because that should really increase the amount of renewable diesel that is on offer. And I mention that because that's actually a drop-in fuel. So for vehicles that are already using diesel, you don't have to get a new vehicle like you would for electric. So renewable diesel isn't as great in terms of carbon for the climate as going full electric is, but it's a great sort of interim step before you replace your vehicle. And so I think that's a really great option. But unfortunately, I'm not aware of construction companies that have gone sort of full in. I know some, like Skanska is an example, they're starting to look at using more renewable diesel, which is really great. And they've done some smaller things. They're doing some, I think, at the light rail construction up toward Everett, sort of going north on the light rail line. They're starting to do that in their construction. So that's one sort of small example, but we're still in the pretty early days. And so again, keep talking about it and keep asking for it of contractors, I think is really important. And that's also why we're trying to push for the state funding. Any other questions from folks or thoughts? Yeah, Robert. Oh, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Early on in your presentation, you had some big state programs that were kind of overarching. Did you say that the residential EV readiness was kind of coming down the pike as well as the commercial?
So the commercial is already there. It's for commercial buildings in larger multifamily buildings. They have to accommodate, I believe it's about 10% of parking spaces have to be EV ready. That's what's happening now. There is a proposal at the State Building Code Council around applying that standard to all buildings. And then of course for residential, if it's one parking spot, you'd have to round up. So that's not passed yet, but it is on the table now and being discussed. So hopefully, in my view, that comes through. Because again, this is, we have state law now that's going to say an increasing percentage ending up being 100% of new vehicles, model year 2035 and on are going to be electric or zero emissions at least. And I would hope that any new homes built right now are going to be around in 2035, and that those folks aren't going to be saddled with any sort of retrofit costs when it's just installing basically the equivalent of a dryer plug in the garage if you have it. So.
Thank you.
Yep. I think Carl, you are next.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Hey, I wanted to ask, you had provided some data about EV charging costs. Did you note what the average was for, the typical cost per kilowatt hour was for, for like a public charging station or something like that across the state? Do we have that kind of data?
I don't have that kind of data off the top of my head. No.
Okay.
Be happy to quickly try to look it up, but it's a little bit tricky, and some of it depends a little bit. There's like different time of day charging rates and stuff, which actually can be good, at least when it's applied to residential, because if everybody goes home with their EV and plugs in right when they get home, so let's say you're working a typical 9 to 5, everybody plugs in at the same time, you're putting more pressure on the grid in that moment and have to build more peak capacity. But if we have chargers that are set up to say like, hey, we're going to start kicking in overnight when hardly anything else is running, all the lights are out, et cetera, that actually is really useful for the grid, and EVs can kind of almost act as a battery in a way, sort of hypothetically. So time of use rates are actually really quite cool for the grid and keeps down costs overall. So all that to say is it can fluctuate a little bit. But I would have to look up what the exact public charging cost is for you per kilowatt hour. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, David, I think you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that infrastructure code that Robert was talking about is a Washington State amendment to Chapter 4 of the IBC, but currently it only applies to new construction.
Yeah.
So we don't know if that would ever change, but it currently Section 429 just applies to new construction that is a B, which is business offices, hotels, and apartment buildings.
Yeah, that's correct. I think the amendment coming through, though, they were going to apply it to all our units as well. So, but we'll see. We'll see if it goes through. Let's see, Barbara.
Yeah, I was wondering, you said for new construction, how about remodels? Is that something that could actually be considered?
That's, I mean, it kind of depends on what and where the remodel is, as if it
Yeah.
would make sense, right? I would personally advocate for, if something fits the threshold, there's usually a threshold of what's considered a substantive remodel, and then they have to sort of meet new code. That's when it would likely kick in.
Mhm. But that's not part of the current regulation. It's just for new.
It's for new right now, is my understanding. But again, if something does hit the substantive remodel sort of threshold, which has to be really significant, they have to meet code anyway. So then it would technically apply to them.
Okay.
Yeah. Carl?
Yeah, along those same lines, I think that's a really good question. Do we know, and does anybody on this call know, what the cost effectiveness of installing electric vehicle infrastructure is when you're building something new versus when we're retrofitting? I know oftentimes when you're retrofitting a building, it's actually more expensive to do this on the backside than it is up front. And maybe you mentioned that in your talk, and I apologize if I missed it, Leah, but I think that would be interesting. I see Jason raising his hand. I'm sure he's got a good answer to that too, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, I do have some numbers I just pulled up. It really highly depends on whether it's residential or like commercial parking, and then again, what kind of commercial parking it is. But it's almost always so much more cost effective to do it during construction. The retrofits can be quite a lot. I just pulled up some numbers. Let's see. So a California study found that providing EV ready outlets and EV level 2 chargers avoids $7,000 to $8,000 per parking spot than if you had to retrofit it later, and that's for larger buildings. This is compared to new construction costs for EV readiness that range from about $280 for a covered garage to $760 for surface lots. So yeah, we're seeing like really significant cost savings. Again, it depends a lot on the type of parking that you're talking about, but yeah, that's why it makes sense to do it new rather than have to do it later. Yeah, Kyla.
Yeah, on that kind of subject, I just wanted to mention that Washington State Department of Commerce recently came out with a fuel switching study that they've conducted, and I don't think it's specific to EV charging, but kind of applies to electrification generally. And they have a lot of numbers in that study on the cost of including electrification upfront in new construction versus retrofitting later.
Great. That would probably be a little bit better than my other study for California. Yeah, Jason.
Thanks, Leah. Yeah, our numbers are about the same. We're about $1,000 for plugs in new homes and about $3,000 to do a retrofit. The other stuff too, the state's just passed this new energy code, heat pumps, conditioned space, all that stuff. That's going to throw about $30,000 to $40,000 onto your cost of new home construction this year. So that's going to get passed on to the consumer. So that's also going to be not a good thing. The other thing to think about too is I see, I'm not Peninsula Light. Are you the power provider out there, Penn Light? I want to make sure we have the power provider out here. I'm not from the Peninsula, so I'm just trying to remember who is your PUD or your investor and utility out there. But I mean, they have to upgrade all the transformers. There's a lot of stuff that goes into full electrification. I know transformers are getting pushed out. They've tripled cost and got pushed back out about 3 times in order to get them ordered. So I mean, there's a lot of headaches that get towards the full electrification. So.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I'm going to push back a little bit on you. I used to certify green homes and work for Master Builders Association of King and Snohomish County, so super well aware of what it costs to put in heat pumps and be EV ready in new home construction. And actually the majority of buildings going up in right over in this area are already including heat pumps because they also include AC. And it's much
Okay.
cheaper to go ahead and do heat pumps rather than do electric and maybe gas or electric resistance, plus have to add on AC, which given climate change is actually a real health risk. Not to mention that like we simply have to do this to meet our climate goals. There's no other way around it. We got to figure it out. So wanted
Totally
to do a
understand.
gentle pushback since it's definitely happening.
I understand. It will just be reflected in the home price, and I just don't want to pass it off on consumers in the state of Washington. So that's
Yeah.
where I come from.
Yeah. Well,
Thank
I
you.
think in that case is why we need to allow more housing to put downward pressure on rates, especially in urban cores. So that gets to the land use conversation. Yeah, I see another question. Jenny, I think.
Yes, thank you. And this is for Kyla, I think. Kyla, you just mentioned some information that was available at Department of Commerce. Could you do me a favor and go over that again, please?
Yeah, and I can forward a link to the like overview PowerPoint and the report. I can send that to Roxanne and she can send it out to everyone and include it in the materials. The Department of Commerce did a study on fuel switching for local public utilities. So the impacts it might have on our utilities and on ratepayers. And they looked at 4 different utilities across different regions, urban versus rural, Western versus Eastern Washington. And they have a lot of really great information compiled on the impacts to residential and commercial buildings, to ratepayers and to those utilities. And I would say based off of the overview PowerPoint that I saw recently from Commerce, there's cost savings for going electric. There's a little bit of upfront costs usually for commercial. It's a little bit more expensive, but then it pays back in reduced maintenance and utility costs. And same for residential, it's cheaper, as we were just talking about, to go electric when it's constructed versus trying to retrofit later. So they have a lot of great data points in that, and I can send those resources over to Roxanne.
Thanks, the link would be appreciated. Thank you.
Jeff.
Yeah, I just am a big part of how Gig Harbor is looking to put EV charging stations and that charging infrastructure in by working with Peninsula Light Company. So I've already been in contact with Michael Prentice over in the engineering group, Peninsula Light Company, about this, and he and I have had some good conversations about this. We are aware of needing to make sure that there is the electrical infrastructure. We do need to extend that conversation and continue that conversation. EV charging stations, we have just a few here in the city. We're looking to do many more, starting with trying to get EV charging stations in at city facilities for employee vehicles, because we are starting to buy hybrid and electric vehicles at all of our facilities. But I have to say, I've received an onslaught of requests for what seem to be simple EV charging stations at streetlight poles. And I think you mentioned it, Leah.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make it very clear, city streetlight poles are not electrified from dawn to dusk. So for us to switch that is not as easy as just popping in a plug-in for an electric charging station. We would have to change our entire electrical lighting infrastructure to make sure that we have electricity 24/7 there. So it's a great idea, but I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different people lately saying, hey, we have a great idea for you. And I say, yeah, it's more than just putting in an outlet. So just wanted to lay that out there.
That's helpful. Is it specific to your area? Because I know Seattle City Light and Tacoma Power are both rolling that out, and it's specifically for folks who are don't have the Seattle City Light program, and also the Tacoma program is sort of prioritizing this, but like areas where folks don't have their own parking, and so they're doing their residential charging just on these street poles. So I don't know what the difference is. So I'm curious if you have that data.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, there are city streetlight poles which are not utility poles. As you said, the utility is Peninsula Light Company, electrical utility is, and so they have their own poles separate from city streetlight poles. The city did this years ago when we first implemented decorative streetlight poles. We set up our control panels so that we have a central control system that eliminates a whole section of lights all at once. That way you have all of your electrical coming into one location, your controls into one location, and it will electrify now an entire swath of poles. So we would have to change how we electrify those poles, which isn't impossible. It's just money, but it's quite a bit of money. And so we probably, if that's the direction we're going to go, we need to have a conversation with council about, do they want to spend that money to electrify every street pole and have it controlled independently instead of through a base panel.
Got it. Got it. Cool. That's a great point. And it does sound like, though, if it's a Penn Light utility pole, then it's just a distinction between that and the city streetlights.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And I did want to offer to you, Jeff, if you ever want me to come into a conversation with Penn Light and you all, I've worked with a lot of different utilities on their transportation electrification plans and have a ton of experience on the clean fuel standard. So be happy to sort of come into any conversations about what's coming into the pipeline.
Yeah, no, actually, that would be great if I can connect with you, and then we can probably bring Penn Light into the conversation, because that's been a key, is to have Penn Light in the city working together to get this in place.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super important. Cool.
Thanks.
Any other questions for folks? Lots of good ones. All right. Lots to do.
Thank you
Leah,
so much, Leah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, Leah, you had mentioned that, you know, this idea of pilot projects and ideas for clean transportation. In other talks that you've given like this, I assume that you've done others. What sorts of examples could you provide us, or what sort of things have you heard from others? I know you gave us a couple during your presentation, but are there other things that you could kind of throw out there that we could think about?
Yeah, definitely. I would say a couple of different ones. So one is school buses. I do think that would take a lot of coordination with the utility as well. Franklin Pierce County School District was the first one to do this. In Tacoma, Power was really involved in getting an electric school bus. And the reason is they wanted to help and install the charging infrastructure. And for these larger vehicles, it's a bit more of a draw on the grid. And so they were really partnering with them and also looking to potentially use those chargers as sort of a battery for the grid in the future. So school buses is a great example. Also garbage trucks, like I mentioned earlier, that has come up, and there are some refuse companies that have worked with cities to, you know, start piloting sometimes a route and sort of figure that out. So that's a good one. This doesn't apply to all, but I'm just going to put it out as an example because maybe there's something similar. But port drayage, which is where when ships come into terminal with those like big containers on them, port drayage is when a truck picks up those containers and brings it to a distribution center or a rail, and they go back and forth. So it's these really short but really heavy hauls from the port to whatever distribution center. And these often go through neighborhoods that are lower income, and they're going back and forth, really polluting. So the city of Seattle is actually working on a demonstration project for that. That's really cool. It's a good example, but if there's any sort of, I don't know if you have anything out there where you would need like short back and forth hauling, that's kind of heavy. That's another really cool example. But honestly, I think what is really cool is if you think of any sort of vehicles that are operating in your area that travel through neighborhoods, that sort of gets at not just the climate element, but also the air pollution element. So again, that's sort of what I would sort of put out there, but school buses and garbage trucks have been good ones. And those are, again, really inefficient diesel vehicles, and we don't want to be breathing those fumes, but we often do. Oh, one other one really quick is local delivery, sort of like small in-city delivery. So I don't know, different things like that. And that could even, it depends on where exactly in the size, but that doesn't even necessarily have to be like a car. It could even be an e-bike model. I know like FedEx has been piloting some of that. So just another little idea to throw out there, but delivery services again, because they're going in neighborhoods.
I was curious, in one of your first slides, you had a slide about reducing freight emissions, and it seemed really ambitious. I think that was a statewide figure, but yeah, I'm just curious where that's going to come from, if that's just like electric trucks, or there are some other modes that folks are thinking about that. I'm not sure if any of that could come from a municipal level, but maybe there are ways that we can make it easier for folks to use different modes for deliveries and
Yeah,
freight.
yeah, that's a great question, because honestly, like sort of cleaning up freight is in the earlier stages. I anticipate that it will come from a combination of electric, potentially electric fuel cell, like green hydrogen is another way, especially for longer haul stuff. That would also apply to potentially even like maritime and rail. Those are really hard to electrify, like big old ships coming into port. Like that is a huge challenge, and it's something that we got to work on. I would also flag, there is an important factor in that freight travel has actually been increasing very sharply over time. And so even sort of decreasing compared to business as usual is going to sort of keep us at the same old place. So there is some thought to be put into freight logistics and trying to make sure that we're being really efficient with our system. You can have different spoke and hub models that I know some delivery services are looking into, where you have a better sort of like distribution center model, and it's more efficient in how they're sort of spreading out from there. But it's a huge challenge. I think it's going to take a lot of different ways to get at it. I know there's a pilot in California right now where they're trying to figure out like an electric truck sharing model, where they have different hubs, and like somebody could drive a truck from one to another and then back and charge it overnight. And it's not necessarily their truck, but they have all the logistics set up for that. So it's a very new space, and it needs a lot of work.
Thank you. Looks
Yeah,
like you have some more questions.
Yeah, I think Barbara was next up.
Yeah. That actually kind of raises a question, because there is some infrastructure we do not have in Gig Harbor, and that is rail or kind of the freight shipping. Now, I could see some scenarios where that could reduce. I mean, that could be infrastructure maybe we should be thinking about incorporating or trying to expand. But information on whether or not that would be worthwhile for us to try to figure out how to get it into the region would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's a toughie. I will say it's important to sort of balance, right? Like we need to do stuff that is going to cut our emissions in the short term, because these like massive projects are going to take a long time to build out. And like at this point, we simply don't have the time. So I do want to make sure that we are sort of focusing on actions that like we can take now in like the next 2 to 3 years that will like rapidly reduce emissions. But I think from a quality of life perspective and like a long-term perspective, it is important to sort of look at the broader infrastructure. I'm not an engineer. I don't know the possibility of like connecting light rail when you're sort of out on the peninsula compared to where the light rail has originated and anything like that. But different ferry options and stuff like that. Electric ferries are actually something that's growing and really exciting. So just putting that out there as maybe a sort of a different thing that could be pretty cool. But yeah, I would say it's important to be creative, but also, keep our eyes sort of on the very near term as well, just in terms of how quickly we need to make these reductions.
And I'll just jump in, Barbara, and you probably know this, but when WashDOT built the new Narrows Bridge, it was supposed to be structurally an earthquake sound so that it could support light rail. They'd have to bring WashDOT into that discussion, but when it was first in the design, that's what they claimed, that it would support light rail in the future.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when I was coming up with my suggestions for policies, because you got a catch-22 there. On the one hand, you've got a pretty high percentage of the workforce in Gig Harbor leaves Gig Harbor every day. So you can either accommodate that by figuring out how to get them on light rail, or you can figure out how to make it so they don't have to drive that far for their jobs. So,
or make sure that their vehicles are electric. I mean, we do want to cut VMT, but like we have to electrify. Even I was just looking at the mode shares for different European cities, including Paris, which is like really great. And like I think it's still about a third of vehicle miles in Paris are by car. Those all need to be zero emissions, right? So it's an all of the above strategy. Jason.
Hey, yeah, just I don't want to sidetrack the conversation too much, but just since I work for ports, Seattle and Tacoma, ports are doing quite a bit. I just wanted to let the group know there's a Northwest Ports Clean Air Emissions Strategy. There's a track to get to zero emissions by 2050. We have a clean truck program, which requires newer trucks to serve our container terminals. We just completed 6 electric drayage trucks, so all electric at one of our facilities. So all good stuff, but in Seattle and Tacoma, at least, I just wanted to let this group know that if you do have specific questions about what the ports are doing, at least the ports in the Pacific Northwest, I'm happy to kind of walk through, or we could even present on that if that was helpful to this group. But I don't want to sidetrack the conversation, but there's a lot going on. We just got approved for a $4.5 million grant to do some electric drayage trucks. So we're starting a coalition working with the Washington Truckers Collaborative Coalition. So lots of exciting stuff. We're a little bit more fuel agnostic. So we want to look at all the different types of technologies, whether it's electric, hydrogen, there's green hydrogen, there's ammonia now is one of the things that they're looking at in terms of energy. But we're really excited about it and committed to getting to zero emissions. Last thing I'll say, just since we've been measuring and since 2005, we've in Seattle, Tacoma, reduced our diesel particulate, which is a human health concern, emissions by 80%, and our greenhouse gases by 20%, just so far. We got a lot more work to do, but we're making some good progress.
Mhm.
Jason, could you send me the newest on the electric drayage trucks? I know you said something about the 6 that you are working on. If you could send me that, that would be awesome.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Awesome.
And actually sending that out to the group, Jason, I think would probably be good too, just to kind of put in our resource library that we're building here. I think it's definitely germane to Gig Harbor, even though it's not directly related to us. I think it matters to us for sure.
What I'll do is I'll send our strategy document, which gets us the zero emissions by 2050, and then that one specific example of those 6 electric drayage trucks.
And by the same token, back to what Jason was talking about earlier, if you've got studies about the costs and the cost effectiveness and non-effectiveness, if that as it were, please send that information over to Roxy as well, so that we can have those studies in the library too. So when we're kind of going into the policy making and decision making portion of this process, we have all of that information up front.
Yeah, happy to.
In the library.
Happy to do that. Just to give you a scope or a concept of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. LA Long Beach have estimated that it would be $100 to $400 billion to zero out their emissions, and we did a really high level back of the napkin in the PNW, and we came up with $1 billion to about $10 billion with a B to reduce all port related emissions.
Wow.
Including the ocean going vessels and stuff, Jason?
Yeah. That's scope 3 stuff. Mhm.
Cool.
Hey, Leah, and are there any studies out there on like local governments sort of switching over to alternative transportation modes, for instance, like building inspectors going out on electric bikes and that kind of thing? I think David would be interested in knowing if there's anything like that out there.
That's a good question. On that specifically, I actually haven't heard. I'm sure I do know the state recently contracted with Atlas EV. Let me see if I can find it, because they did a survey of local governments to see like what percentage of their fleet was electric so far. And I do think there was some cost info there. I don't know if it's quite what you're looking for, but that's like the closest to home thing I can think of off the top of my head. So I'll see if I can find that and if it's helpful. Yeah.
Oh, that would be really helpful. Yeah, if there's some numbers out there on that, I think we would be very interested to get those from you.
There have been some cities that have given their building inspectors electric cars. Seattle, for example, is one of them. I'm sure you could call up their building department and they would be able to tell you their experience using them. But because they're just driving around Seattle, which, although a big place, is not that big. My understanding is they've been able to make it work. I don't think all of their inspectors use electric cars, but I know that some of them do. And some other cities have done that as well. I mean, LA for a while had electric police cars. Not all of them, but some of them. They didn't work out so well.
Well, the city of Gig Harbor is talking about that, and that's one of the things that that is definitely being kicked around right now. And I think I see Jenny shaking or nodding her head, so I know that she's been a champion of that. And so we're moving in that direction. It'll be a little experimental, especially when you talk about emergency vehicles and first responders and things. But I think the city is definitely interested in a pilot project in that manner, and maybe Jenny can speak more to it when she gets an opportunity there.
Hey, Carl, I don't mean to cut in front of Jenny. We're doing the same thing, and we use the state's procurement to purchase vehicles. I don't know how the city of Gig Harbor, but my understanding is a lot of municipalities use the state's procurement process. Right now, there's a 2-year wait for an electric vehicle.
Yeah.
So plan for that as you think about when you can actually roll it out.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, I had heard that actually. We've been waiting on just a hybrid vehicle for almost a year now. Not even fully electric. So
Yeah, and we're projecting to buy some all electric half-ton trucks, and in the 2023-24 budget, I don't think we're going to get them in that 2-year period.
Supply chain, y'all. I'm getting a bike, even it's in like the bike, like everything is backed up.
It can be hard to get a gas car now too, depending on what you want as well. So it's not just electric, it's everything. But hopefully that'll be worked out. And I'm sure Leah knows this in more detail than I do, but there have been some amazing battery technologies that are right now in the process of being commercialized, that are really going to change charge times and capacities and costs. And there's a lot of analysis out there that shows that electric cars are going to soon be cheaper than gas cars.
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff on the battery front. I did want to say there's actually a lot of really good examples of police cruisers that are electric. I was just reading a story about one in Indiana that's working super well. Not a place that you would necessarily think of as like EV champions, but the officers there were really enthusiastic about it. And one other thing that I'm finding very intriguing, there's one electric fire truck in operation in the US. It's in LA. That's very cool. Definitely there's, it's not one of the massive ones, but it could suit some purposes. And it does have backup diesel if needed. But it's actually really good. My partner used to be a firefighter, and being around those diesel fumes when you're already around a lot of other pollution and the noise of that, when you need to be aware of your surroundings. So there's a lot of pros. It's very nascent, but it's another good sort of demo project idea. So yeah, let's see, we have Kyla, I think, next.
Sure. I wanted to bring up something that I think came up in one of our first meetings, which was about just sort of like Piers transit service in Gig Harbor and limited bus services and things like that. And I was wondering if maybe Leah, you have any good examples of pilots or other kind of like first and last mile connections to transit that might work for Gig Harbor.
Yeah, that's a great idea. One thing that actually has been operating in my neighborhood, so again, I live in South Seattle and I'm kind of near the light rail, but like the light rail catchment area for some of these stations is really significant. And Seattle actually piloted a program where they had like vans that you could get that would like basically, if you're in a certain radius from the light rail, it's on demand, they would basically pick you up and drop you off. So that's a great example. Unfortunately, these were not electric vehicles, but I think that would be really cool if it was sort of paired up, right? So that's just one example that I know of. There's also this sort of, again, it sort of depends on where you are and if it feels safe, if you have a safe infrastructure, but there's a lot of micromobility options as well to catch an e-scooter or an e-bike the rest of the way, but that is sort of contingent on making sure people would feel safe getting from that, those points to points on a scooter or a bike. But those are two off the top of my head that I know of. David.
I just wanted to piggyback on Carl's comments about building inspectors riding e-bikes. I think Gig Harbor is kind of a mixed bag because we're such a small town. We only cover 6 square miles, right? And we do have inspectors that are out a majority of their day, but they make a lot of stops. So in that sense, you know, you have start, stop, which would be great to have an electric vehicle. But then again, I'm kind of concerned about the return on investment because we have 20-year-old vehicles with 40,000 miles on them. You know, so you have that infrastructure that you're buying, you're investing in an electric car. You know, what's the life cycle of these batteries and what's the environmental cost of those batteries to replace? You know, I think it's tough. I think that for us, we owe it to our citizens to be sensible, right? So I think maybe if we could replace some of the really old gas guzzler vehicles in our fleet and even go to hybrids, right? We would make leaps and bound improvement over what our current situation is. And then since we're talking about other departments, I was just wondering, Leah, have you ever heard of an electric street sweeper?
I haven't, but I think that would be cool. And definitely possible, honestly. Like those, let's see, electric streets. I'm Googling it right now.
I feel like I have heard of them, but I don't remember where.
Yep, I see some. Yep. They exist. So I think that would be great. And again, that's sort of an example of things, you know, going near where people are. I will flag for you just really quickly, David, on sort of like the sunk environmental costs. Most studies show that like if you go with electric and replace a gas powered or diesel powered vehicle with electric, after like only a couple of years, the electric is still better. So just putting that out there, like I think a lot of people have a lot of concerns about batteries, which are warranted, but it's a little overblown compared to the actual footprint to gas or diesel. And also those, especially new gas and diesel, have a lot of batteries themselves. So just wanted to put that out there as a little bit of a flag in terms of emissions.
No, I hear you, Leah. It's just that literally our miles are so low each year that, I mean, and we have such an old fleet overall that, you know, just moving, modernizing, even going hybrid, or, you know, it would be a tremendous step in the right direction, I think. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I would definitely echo if you are prioritizing vehicles like the older ones, like that makes the most sense for sure. I would also just say when it comes to hybrid, I would still look toward electric for a couple of reasons. One is that the cost effectiveness, especially over time, even if you're doing low miles, like that could still sort of hit you there. It depends on the miles, but at least as like a public agency, you're sort of better able to amortize costs over time. So I would just sort of flag doing that analysis up front. Because that's still a pretty big gap between, depending on the vehicle, hybrid and electric in terms of MPG and PTE.
Just a time check. We have 5 more minutes. So Barbara, let's make this the last question.
Quick. Okay. Well, I was just going to say, I think it might be wise to start looking at an electric street sweeper. One is they don't have to be as big as we're used to thinking of them as being. There's a lot of different size ranges, but street sweeping is also one of the things. Increasing street sweeping is also a recommendation for improving stormwater quality. And if we're encouraging the installation of pervious pavement, that needs to be maintained. So just food for thought. I'm on board with getting the electric street sweeper.
I think that's a great pilot project, y'all.
Okay, well, thank you all for your really awesome participation. Just as a reminder, our next meeting is going to be on the 27th, so in 2 weeks, and we're going to have folks from PSRC talking to us, Department of Commerce, not PSRC, we already had them, talking to us about kind of statewide opportunities. I applied for a climate change grant. They were supposed to notify us like 2 weeks ago about whether or not we received it. So hopefully have some updates for y'all by the next meeting. The grant is intended to support the development of climate action plans. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. Thank you so much to Tim and Leah for leading us through these concepts. And everybody, don't forget to send me 2 goals or policies related to what we talked about today. Density, land use, community design, electrification, all those types of things will be great to have you thinking about and sending me resources and goals and policies. And just as a reminder, send them to me, not to Cindy or Michelle or anybody else. Send them to me. All right, everybody, enjoy your afternoon. Thank you so much.
Roxanne, could I just say really quick,
Yes.
could we also add on to the homework the idea of these pilot projects? 'Cause I think that would be really interesting. How do you feel okay about that? Sorry to jump in like that, but I think that would be really interesting to hear what people's thoughts are on various pilot projects that the city, realistic pilot projects that the city could potentially implement over the next 10 years, 20 years, if we're looking at our planning horizon here.
I've been getting some great suggestions for pilot projects. Some folks have suggested like solar, solar panel pilot projects, stuff like that. So yeah, great point. Okay. Any other things before we sign off? Okay, great. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye.